Hello, everyone. On behalf of Portman Partners and the Tech Capital, I welcome you to Perspectives on Sustainability. The topic of sustainability has dominated the data center industry conversation in 2021 and will likely continue to do so in 2022 and beyond. While the majority agree climate change is an ever-intensifying worry for our planet and that more sustainable practices are essential to the viability of data center businesses, not all agree on the best path to a greener future. Before we get going, just a bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded and will be made available on demand after today's discussion. Do please also keep your video off and audio on mute at all times throughout the stream. We recommend setting your Zoom to speaker view through the button at the top right corner of your Zoom window. We will also have a Q&A session at the end of the discussion, so please put your questions in the chat box. And if they are directed to a specific panelist, please indicate that when submitting the question. In case we run out of time to cover all the questions, our speakers might be able to get back to you post-panel. But let's get started. And today we have brought together great minds from the data center industry and academia to discuss best practices, priorities, and the right next steps for the sector. I would like now to welcome our impressive panel of experts, which includes Seymour, founder and CTO of Future Facilities, a software company that utilizes virtual prototyping to design and manage data center facility performance. Ian Bitterlin, a Portman Partners Associate, a UK chartered engineer, trainer and author with more than 30 years experience in the data center industry. Crosby, founder and CEO of Compass Datacenters. Wendi Runyon, Vice President of Strategy and Innovation at Schneider Electric. Dan Scarbrough, the founder of Rockstar, a specialist consultancy working in sustainable digital infrastructure. And Acton, a chartered engineer, chartered IT professional, and independent consultant and technical advisor with more than 25 years of experience in the data center sector. But now let's get started and let's talk about what people actually really care about. I mean, colocation developers and enterprise clients, what do these people care about? Is it low PUE? Is it affordability? Is it energy effectiveness? What do people care about?
I still don't find many players in the data center industry who are building colos and enterprise especially, who actually put energy efficiency or sustainability at the top of their list. They put availability and uptime and reliability and service at the top of their list. And sustainability comes high on the list simply because they want to put something nice in the corporate sustainability report or social responsibility report. Having said that, this drive for renewables, as Mark referred to, is at the moment, when you consider that renewables are a finite resource and very few countries are powered by anywhere near higher than 50 or 60% renewables, the fact that it is a finite resource means that there's no reason on earth why data centers should grab it all and then waste it. And to Mark's point, we are at the moment wasting a lot of energy, whether it's renewable or not, on relatively frivolous applications. But if we were standing waist deep in water, floodwater, or in a forest fire that was caused by climate change, we probably wouldn't want to stream HD video to our phones. That's what I mean by frivolous. I don't mean that people can't make money out of it. I don't mean not that it's not fun and it's not entertainment. But if we're going to take climate change seriously, I think just saying, well, our data center is renewably powered, therefore we are sustainable, it won't actually last for very much longer as a valid sales mantra.
I think that's a very good valid point and something that definitely the industry needs to get to grips with. Seymour?
Yeah, I think Ian probably picked up on a number of the points that I was going to raise, but I think the key thought that has stuck in my mind from a very senior data center authority from years gone by who ran a lot of data centers, he said to me, Mark, the main reason I worry about energy and sustainability is because I don't want the government to interfere. So if we're seen to be doing something about it, then we do something about it. This means that we've got all the wrong motivation. The motivation is just to try and retain control of our own destiny rather than to really be sustainable. And that to me needs to change because the data center industry is going to carry on consuming more and more power because of all the things Ian mentioned. So we need to try and stop that. And the only way is if we're really intent on being sustainable.
That's interesting. The government aspect is very interesting. And Chris, as an operator, what's your view?
Not quite as Malthusian. as my teammates here. What I would say is, look, I do think that there is a lot of greenwashing in terms of how things are done, renewable energy credits and the like. I find it difficult that nuclear power isn't included in the discussions in terms of base load from a zero emissions perspective, and we should globally be focusing on that. Why that's not even in the discussions right now is very frustrating from my perspective, because renewables aren't able to provide that good base load. That said, I think that without the data center industry, I don't think some of the innovation would have occurred in the renewable space that has occurred. And it has occurred at scale because of, the ability of the sector. Where I think our sector is falling down is we use the term stewardship at Compass. We don't use the term sustainability. We are builders and we do operate these facilities, and we have to use our resources wisely. And I think the way that we think about the supply chain and what materials that you're using, how efficient are you doing it, where that waste is going, are you creating more waste? That's portion of the conversation has not come to light yet. When we talk about getting to carbon, zero or whatever, those are really the first two categories and not the third, which is how you actually build things. So I think from an industry perspective, that focus on how we use our resources wisely is something that I think we have to do.
Interesting. And and I guess we also have to remember that it's not something just exclusive to our sector. There's a lot of other sectors going through this as well, but data centers are kind of leading the way in some of the changes and mindsets that we are putting towards our market. Sorry, Ian, would you like to add something else?
Yeah, to your point about we're not leading the way, I guess we are leading the way because our power consumption is growing so quickly as opposed to other sectors where actually power consumption is already going down. So we deserve to be in the forefront and we deserve to draw it. But to one point, the point that Chris made was really important, which is certainly true, is that the data centers that we know about and speak about are funding the expansion of renewables. There's no doubt about that. The problem that many countries have got is that they're doing that and then they're using it all. And so when the wind doesn't blow, just to pick on one very popular renewable, when the wind doesn't blow, the grid has to burn non-renewable fuel to plug the gaps. So you've got this strange situation where you can end up with, in a local area, the data centers consuming all of the renewable power that they funded, and the statistics looking very good because they will consume as much as they will demand as much as they consume over a full year. But when the wind blows too hard, the country benefits. When the wind doesn't blow hard enough, the country has to burn non-renewables. And so we're hiding our good behavior under a blanket of greenwash. That's the point. But there's no doubt that Chris was right. We are funding an awful lot of renewable investment.
That's interesting. I think the point you actually made about the wind as well, there's an energy crisis going on in the UK. Part of it's because of gas, but part of it is also because of the lack of wind in this country over the last few months, which is interesting. Dan, what would you like to contribute?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things I wanted to say. And one which sounds strange, but has only more recently dawned on me, is that, we talk about sustainability, but climate change, and I was having a conversation with a friend of mine around this COP26 event that's taking place in Glasgow. It really needs to be seen as an extinction level event, right? So it's not something, and whether it's scientifically proven or not, I don't think we can take a risk within that fact that future generations, unless we really do something about it now, are going to suffer in one way, shape or form. The UN meeting that's taking place this year in Glasgow, those meetings started in '92, so over 30 years ago. So we've been on this with the United Nations for roughly 30 years. So, the fact that we're expecting these meetings to materialize some radical change, again, I think that's quite a high expectation. So that's on the one side, so not related to this industry. And then the second thing, coming back to what Mark Acton said earlier, I think it's about how do you measure and how do you benchmark the performance of any industry in any sector, right? There doesn't seem to be a way to correlate how individual organizations are faring in their journey towards zero carbon, and what that common metric is that we can align ourselves around as an industry, whether it's a CO2 per kilowatt hour or whatever that metric might be. But I think there is a requirement for the industry to develop or agree on a metric that all of the operators can benchmark themselves on. So that's my take on it.
Wendi, would you like to go next?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with Dan. I don't think we can afford to do nothing. I think we have to aggressively go forward now. And the data center industry has been leaders in innovation and pushing the limits within our group. So I feel like the data center industry has to take a leadership position here. We're not going to be successful in trying to say users have to stop streaming, have to stop leveraging the technology. It's going to continue to grow and grow. And even just a webinar like this with COVID, more working from home, we're going to see more and more usage of the technology that's putting the pressure on the data centers to grow fast. And the only way for us to be able to make change and have those renewable conversations within data center builds is to start now, test different technologies now, pilot them, see what works and what doesn't. But I also agree with the fact that we don't have the right metrics of success today. If we knew what we were working towards, we could then set a benchmark of the designs today and then fight for how do we every year get more sustainable. If we knew what those metrics are and we can agree as an industry what those metrics are, then every year we can push as is industry to try to drive a greater sustainability via a common aligned metric system.
Okay, that's interesting. And how do you think we go about into creating those standards, those metrics? That we can all abide by? Or do we just need another industry association? Do we just need meetings? I would just remember our attendees as well to keep both microphones and cameras off, please. Yeah, so Wendi, how do you think we go about creating those metrics or agreeing on those metrics?
Sure. I mean, I think it's an industry comes together as a whole and says, we know the pressure on data centers is huge because data centers are one of the biggest consumers of energy. So how do we change the mindset of what the data center is from just being that consumer of energy to also partnering with the utility, coming up with new ways to be able to also become a producer as well as, the whole prosumer concept. So I feel like if we as an industry say, this is what we define the metrics of success for driving a more sustainable planet, then we're doing it for the right reasons. I agree, there is a lot of just marketing around this, but the reality is we have to be doing this for the right reasons, even if at times it costs more. And even if at times it gets in the way of us trying to deploy and execute on what we're trying to execute for this year's metrics of success. So I believe it has to be the data center industry coming together as a whole with the utilities and being able to say, this is what we believe will truly drive down the carbon emissions to be able to help with this crisis that we're going into over the next few years.
That's very interesting. And thinking as well what Dan said about being an extinction level event, I think that money shouldn't be an objection to doing anything right in this sense. But Mark Acton, what would you like to add?
Yeah, it was interesting. I think the point on standards and metrics is absolutely valid. I think, the root and trunk of the problem that we have in our industry, as Dan quite rightly said, is that we can't really measure performance. I think, it's a fundamental problem. Unless we can actually demonstrate a value for useful work done, then we're going to struggle. And I think unless we can do that, we are certainly going to have governments and regulators on our backs because we've got a huge target painted on our back. We consume a lot of energy, but cannot demonstrate efficiency or sustainability around that. I think one of my biggest frustrations is that we actually do have KPIs and metrics. We've got standardized ISO metrics as part of the, let's say, the 30134 series that we're not actually using. Most people aren't even aware that PUE is defined as 30134-2. Within that series, we've also got REF, so renewable energy factor. We've got ERF, energy reuse factor. We've got CUE, carbon usage. We've got WE, water usage. And yet most people aren't aware of them. And very, very few people are using them. So, it seems a bit silly. I don't think it's about more standards. I think it's about more education around standards and using what we've got rather than trying to create something new just yet.
That's a good point. And I mean, there's already a lot of things around in the industry as well. We don't need to overcomplicate it even more.
Exactly. It's a confused landscape as it is. Let's not have more. Let's use what we've got.
Yeah, let's just get down to doing the work, actually.
Exactly.
Mark Seymour.
Yeah, thank you. Whilst I agree with Mark that we have lots of metrics, I think it's really important to recognise that we don't have anything which takes us down to what we actually produce with it. So we're in no way connected to how much useful work comes out of it. So however green we get, it doesn't mean that we're using that energy really well. And that's something we don't have a metric for. And everybody always says, oh, well, it's very difficult because all different industries are doing different things. But we could be measuring against the number of operations done or something basic if we can't agree on how to measure different types of activities. We have to do that. Otherwise, we'll never really be heading towards sustainability because we won't be doing good work for the energy we're getting.
Is there like an industry that you can think of that's doing something in the right way or along those lines that we could look into for inspiration? I'll come to you in a second.
Sorry, can I just answer that since I raised it? Do you mind?
Yeah, no, it was for you, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know that we even need to look to other industries. We have seen individual players within the data center industry do this and show how much work they're doing. But people always say, well, that doesn't work for me. The point is we have to start somewhere, and we could take some of those models and start applying them instead of using excuses for, oh, it's too difficult to cross-apply. We could be doing it on basic compute.
Okay. Ian, so you wanted to say something?
It was just to Mark and to Mark's point, actually. Mark Acton mentioned every conceivable metric apart from the ones that were written for sustainability workload metrics, which was ITEE and ITEU, and they are based on Mark Seymour's idea of measuring compute capacity. So you're meant to choose the fastest hardware you can. You're not meant to idle it. You're meant to utilize the hell out of it, and you get a good score. It'll never be used. It's far too complicated, and it's very self calibrating. You have to calibrate yourself into it and then use it. But we have got some people that have tried it before, but they're all examples given, as Mark said, about it doesn't apply to us. Like eBay. eBay were probably the first into it. They started measuring unit sales per kilowatt hour. And as long as it keeps on going up every year, it means they're getting more and more efficient at what they do. They weren't talking about value of it, just the transaction. But it doesn't apply to a government tax office. You can't measure successful prosecutions for tax avoidance per kilowatt hour, can you? Or child care cases per kilowatt hour. That's the real problem. And the biggest problem we've got, I've got 2 points really. The biggest problem we've got is that sustainability really goes back to what the opening remark of this panel was, is that we should be reducing our IT load. Sustainability is defined as you reduce what you do, you improve what you do, and then you renewably power it. And what we've done for the last 20 years is concentrated on the second step, PUE. And the last step, power it from renewable energy, is what we're now doing. We always ignored the first one, which was reduce demand. And you can't be sustainable unless you actually reduce demand. And on that subject, I'll nearly finish. I'll just make the point that here we are talking about it online, and half the world doesn't have an internet connection. And climate change is affecting that half of the world much more so far than it's affecting our part of the world. So we better get real and start to be responsible for the whole planet, not just the rich few of us that can afford to sit on our bums watching Zoom calls most of the day. We have got to get serious about it. And my point about reduction in load comes about, what do you think the rest of the world's going to do when they get their internet connection if we don't give them a good example? They're going to get and use social networking.
I mean, that's very interesting in terms of also educating people outside the industry. It's almost flipping the coin on taking away things from data centers to also educating users on how to use a bit less to be a bit more environmentally friendly. But Dan, what would you like to add?
I was just going to say that one of the other things I think we need to be much more focused on is embedded carbon and scope 3 emissions in the entire end-to-end design of the building, the hardware, all the way up through the stack from the grid up to the application, because that's where 70% or roughly 70% of carbon emissions are located. So I think there should be more focus on integrating an embedded carbon metric into the stuff that we're doing.
Very, very interesting. And we'll talk about as well architectures in a second. But Chris.
Yeah, I'd like to fundamentally disagree on a few points here. I'm a software guy. Because I write shitty software and I utilize more of the CPU does not mean that that's better. That is a fundamental error that our industry continues to think, and we have to stop it. There's a bifurcation between hardware and software. So we need to stop talking about the software and the utilization because we don't know what we're talking about, frankly. You can write poor software and have high utilization. That's not good. So the second is when we talk about reduction in IT load, I also fundamentally disagree. Look at what happened with COVID. I mean, you could see the bottom of the Venice Canal. We shifted load, KW, from cars manufacturing KW and putting greenhouse gas into the data center environment, which was a much more controlled environment when it came to greenhouse gas emission. So you have to think holistically in terms of shift of capacity. It is on a holistic basis from an industry perspective. It is not just our industry. If we take from bad areas and put it into a more efficient environment, that's good for the environment. I'm not saying it's perfection, but there is no such thing as perfection. The third is nobody talks about China. If you look at the Western nations, the greenhouse gas emissions are going down. We have unequivocal evidence of that, and China is going very high. We are not putting the right amount of pressure internationally on the Chinese. And finally, I'd love to agree with Dan. We can control our scope 3. That is an area we can focus on, and we should be focused on scope 3 of how we produce and how we build and build better.
No, that's a very interesting point on how we build and how we build better, because sometimes we might not even need to actually build from ground up. We can use things that already exist, and they might have a bit less of an impact on the environment. I don't know if the panel agrees with that, but Mark, Seymour, would you like to carry on?
Yes, well, it picks up on that point because I wanted to pick up on what Dan said about embedded energy, because one school of thought is that you should refresh your IT hardware really regularly because it is getting more and more efficient. But I think when you take into account embedded carbon, dismantling buildings that perhaps haven't really reached their intended life because we can make them build a more efficient one, or replacing hardware because there is newer, more efficient hardware out there, may well not be the most efficient way forward. In my opinion, we're a bit too quick and easy with throwing stuff away as a society. And so we should not be doing that without a proper analysis of whether it really makes sense in a holistic way. I completely agree with Chris.
That's very interesting. There's a few operators that do exactly that as well. And it's interesting to see. And one of them was actually interesting that during COVID, they were kind of forced into building a facility, even though they usually just pick up on old buildings and they renovate them into a data center. Ian.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on something that Chris said, which was quite right, is we should be worried about China. But let's face it, the reason why our emissions are going down and theirs are going up is that they've become the factory of the world. There's no point pretending that we've got a manufacturing industry in the UK anymore. That's why our grid is smaller than it's ever been. That's why our grid demand is going down, is because we have no more industry. So we've become a service-based economy. That's the first thing. The second point about emissions, it's very difficult. You can't make the same statement in the States as you can in Norway, for example. In Norway, it's worthwhile hanging on to every bit of hardware you possibly can because the grid's already 100% renewable and you can then leverage the hell out of the embedded carbon. If you're in a grid that's dominated by coal power, you've got to think about, actually, you could do the sums. Actually, the embedded carbon is repaid very quickly if you refresh your hardware every couple of years. So it really does depend on location. But, you know, we can't boil the ocean. We can't attack everything at the same time. And we certainly can't carry on consuming more at a time when we've got to worry about greening more.
No, it makes perfect sense as well. And that, I mean, different regions have different requirements. But Wendi, picking up on all that as well and talking about how we encourage companies to prepare for the future while delivering on aggressive goals of today, we do live in a very intensive time for data centers. Everyone needs a data center, and COVID just came to even put even more pressure. I would say probably good pressure on the sector to expand. What's your view?
Sure. I wanted to hit on one point, though, that Mark made about the retrofit, because in the data industry, we're now at the point where, you know, a lot of these data centers are at the point where they are needing to be retrofitted. I mean, 20, 30 years ago in terms of build, where it used to be the data center industry is so new, and we are doing a lot of new builds, but we do have a lot of existing data centers that need the retrofit. And it's only fair to do the analysis. And I'm not claiming that you need to throw everything out and start over, but you got to do the analysis to understand where there are opportunities to drive sustainable solutions in a retrofit situation or in a modernization, adding the intelligence, being able to start to really look at the equipment that's being made, and is the entire value chain focused on sustainability and replacing old legacy equipment with newer, more efficient and connected or intelligent equipment. I think that's a must. I don't think it becomes well, we don't really need to look, just throw everything out because of the cost. I think everybody, it's in our best interest, and we should, as leaders in the data center industry, should be pushing everyone to be doing that analysis. To your point about now moving forward, how do we change mindset? It kind of goes back to the point I was trying to bring up earlier around data centers are huge consumers, and the only way that we start to have the data center play a role where it pays back is to start to look at some of these distributed energy resources. In the US, looking at solar and battery energy storage, and being able to find ways to turn the data center into that prosumer so it can start to give back at times where the power's not needed, or consume at the times that it is needed, and work on new models where we can really stop data centers from just being this huge energy consumer moving forward. So I think those new models and new ways of thinking, we have to really push in the industry, because right now it's all about speed and cost of builds, but it's up to the leaders, it's up to being able to test new ways of doing this where we can have an impact on the world together. That's the way I see it in terms of moving forward.
That's very interesting. I think there's a few lessons in the Nordics that we can look into for that as well. And actually, as we were talking about sharing the energy that you might not need when you don't need it, that kind of remind me of the auctions in the European Union, when a country doesn't need as much energy and the other countries need more energy. So there could be something to look at in the data center space. But Dan?
Yeah, I just got two points I thought might be interesting. Some of the stuff that I've seen is organizations that are including the carbon intensity of materials as part of their CapEx budgets, and then they're leveraging some form of offsetting against that CapEx budget. So it's encouraging them to use lower carbon intense products or lower carbon intense materials, because there is a cost of that carbon as part of their CapEx in whatever product they're producing, is one thing. And then the other thing that I think we also need to look at is these kind of guarantees of origin and these RECs that the industry's kind of working on. It's about, what real impact can this industry have on net new energy and future renewable energy production? And can data center operators directly track their renewable energy credits or guarantees of origin against the new renewable that is being generated? Because my understanding of guarantees of origin is it's almost a tradable commodity. So there are people making money in that, and quite often it might change hands, up to 16 times before it actually gets to the energy producer. So the amount of money going to the net new energy production from a REC and a guarantee of origin is relatively small. So if operators can focus on, the impact of net new renewable energy on their guarantees of origin, I think that'd be a positive thing to do.
Definitely. Let me just remind our viewers that if you'd like to ask some questions, do please place your questions in the chat box. We'll start going over them in about 15, 20 minutes or so. But Ian, on to you.
Yeah, a couple of people have mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic and the increased use of data centers. I'd just like to point out one thing that, traffic I'll just talk about Europe. traffic in Europe did go up 20%. It's quite straightforward. You can see the statistics in the internet exchanges, real data, not guesstimates. But the interesting thing is the peak and the trough of that 24-hour cycle in data traffic didn't change. It's always been a peak at 9 p.m. and it's always been a trough at 4 a.m. It's not business. It wasn't Zoom business calls or lack of, it wasn't. It was just to do with the fact that our consumption went up by that 20%, and yet still it was dominated by domestic streaming and gaming, and social networking. It was at 9 p.m. in Europe and 4 a.m. when people are asleep at the trough. So it certainly did teach us a lesson. What it taught us is that you can work from home, but it didn't actually raise the overall load. It's now drifted back to what it was before, but it's still going up 4% per month. I mean, that's for 25 years. Traffic in Europe has been rising by 4% compound every month. That's why we have more data centers. If you take off of the effect of all Moore's law and all its derivatives, you get a 10% gap between demand growth and capacity growth. So it does come down to demand. That's what we've got to cope with first. Then we can do all the good stuff after we've coped with demand.
That's interesting. But would you say that the pandemic has not had an impact in terms of the sustainability side of the data center? What was the impact that the pandemic had in terms of data centers going green? Did they have to kind of leave that to the side a little bit to keep up with demand?
No, I think all we did was we started to use up the spare capacity that we got in the fact that most of our data centers, with the exception of the hyperscalers, most of our data centers are underloaded and underutilized, and the hardware is underutilized generally. And the extra demand just pushed the data centers to work harder, which I think is a good thing. Actually, to Chris's point, it's actually a good thing that we end up with more load on the infrastructure we've got, because we, at the end of the day, as Mark Seymour said earlier on, it was Chris Crosby said earlier on, it doesn't matter how good your code is, it doesn't matter how efficient you are, if you're just idling, it's not going to do you any good at all.
Interesting. Chris, coming to you now.
Yes, we talk a little bit about the evolution side of things. I mean, there's no solve that fixes everything. And when we think about the evolution of things, whether it be Brazil going from burning wood to maybe we give them propane or coal would be better than burning wood, as a for example. Like, what's that evolution that these countries make? That's on a country level. But what evolution can we make in the data center space? And when I look at it, and you think about the microgrids, and you think about for example, in the US, where we do have an ample supply of natural gas, and to do localized natural gas and then having the ability to give back on the grid, like Wendi said, is that the be all end all? No. Is it a potentially much better solution than what we're currently doing? Absolutely. Is it on the path towards a good solution? And I think we've got to start thinking about things in terms of these steps. I understand we want to talk about an extinction level event and things like that, but you still have to walk to get there. I mean, there is no perfect solution. And until we can get some zero emission nuclear as most of this base load, right, to resolve a lot of these issues, what are we doing to get to that point? How do we get there to that point? How do we minimize, to Ian's point on the data centers taking up the whole grid? We'll localize some of that production, right? Is it still a fossil fuel that has to get used in those cases? Many times, yes. But can you mitigate some of that through the use of battery storage or other types of energy storage? Absolutely. I just think that this view that we're going to solve everything in one fell swoop is just it's not plausible, and it hasn't worked for us, right? The government's not going to solve it. Industry has to advance things. Industry is the way that this is going to get done, and we've got to support those initiatives and frankly praise these companies that are taking these leaps. And yes, maybe they're doing it for political purposes or this or that, but it is dragging people along, and that is a good thing as we continue to grow as an industry.
Interesting. But are we going too slow, or do we need to speed up?
I absolutely think we should speed up. I mean, I would love to have the ability to put, a 300 megawatt localized plant on a campus. But the regulatory environment to do something like that is just so prohibitive. I think some of the things that we're trying to do to protect us from an energy, from a greenhouse gas perspective on a regulatory basis are actually the opposite, creating the opposite effect and exacerbating the issue. And we've got to stop thinking that we're going to have bureaucrats that are going to solve this. They're not going to solve it.
Okay, that's interesting. We're starting to get a few questions from our viewers. So we'll quickly finish this round and then we'll go into the questions. Mark, Acton?
Yeah, I think, just picking up on some of Chris's points there, I think we've got a bit of a dichotomy, haven't we? I think firstly, governments are potentially criticizing us as an industry for using excessive amounts of energy or power. And then at the same time demanding that there are more digital services available for their citizens. So, they're not exactly being joined up in this. So on the one hand, we're being criticized, but on the other hand, we're being asked to sort of improve and grow and deliver more service. And I think that kind of highlights really that we have in our industry, and I'd argue that the data center industry is not an industry; it's a sector made up of multiple industries. So it's difficult to really say that we're particularly cohesive. And I think we are very, very siloed. Chris made the point about software. Absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, you can have very inefficient code and make your hardware run apparently more efficiently, but of course that's not the answer. The answer is having efficient hardware, and efficient facilities. And at the moment, we're heavily siloed. We don't really know the true cost of digital services, or the true energy cost, of digital services. It's not particularly transparent. And I don't think that software developers and even some hardware manufacturers get the full impact of the energy efficiency element in a data center. So, I think part of the future has to be that we're more joined up and that we actually understand the true energy cost of supplying digital services. Unless we do that, we'll get nowhere, frankly.
That's interesting. I mean, in my mind, I keep playing crypto mining as well.
Don't even go there. That's even more complex. I think we all know.
Yeah, I think because we're talking about data centers, but if you look into crypto mining, then we're talking everything.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah. I agree. That's a separate topic, I think. But yeah, right.
Yeah, Mike, Seymour.
Yeah, so I really want to build on some of the stuff that Mark Acton was saying. I think the point is that we've actually done some good things as an industry where we've focused on things. So, energy consumption going into cooling and power systems compared with the IT has gone down over time. We've done some good jobs, but we haven't focused on the whole thing. We need to look at all the steps in the process. So we need to look at, how we're utilizing equipment. We need to look at whether we're utilizing the facilities well, because we waste a lot of facilities, never get anywhere near their potential capacity, and that's wasting energy because they're never running at their potential best PUE because they never reach 100% load. So there are lots of things, and the same applies to where we locate data centers. There's a trend to big data centers because it's easy to stick your stuff out in the cloud, et cetera, but that's not necessarily the most efficient way to deal with things. We might be better having more local compute rather than this massive trend away from local compute. One rather disconnected thought I just wanted to make on Ian's comment about the increase in the pandemic. I think the shape increased entirely. So the shape stayed much the same. So whilst the peak stayed in the same place, everything did increase. So even industrial use and commercial use did go up in the same sort of proportion. Everything went up. So it probably was a saving from other energy uses for all sectors, even in industry, because we were doing things more efficiently without jetting around the world. I know for one, I haven't been to the US once since the pandemic, and I used to go, sometimes double figures times a year. So, there are a lot of flights that we haven't done.
That's interesting as well, how we could potentially compare our carbon footprint pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. And if actually working from home is actually worse than it was as we were traveling 40 times a year to the other side of the world. But let me just go to Dan and then to Wendi as well. Dan.
I just wanted to come back to Chris's reference to the extinction level event. I think the reason I said it is too often people feel like climate change is something that's coming and that we've got time to deliver or time to do something about. And I firmly believe that we've been of that same mindset for the last 30 years. So I do understand that everyone needs to do their own small thing, and we as an industry have made some very positive impacts, but I think there needs to be some more urgency about it. And that's why I kind of drew that to people's attention.
Okay, thank you. And Wendi.
Yep. So I wanted to hit on 2 points. First, the thought about the transportation industry potentially going down because of COVID and the data center industry going up. It's probably truth. I'm sure I wouldn't say that the data center industry is consuming more energy than transportation at this point, but it definitely saw a shift because of the focus of less travel, more online. More online means more data center pressure. I think that is especially here in the U.S. with some of the announcements of electric. Can you not hear me?
Sorry, if you just go back to the transportation bit and repeat from there. I don't know if it was just me or if everyone else had the problem, but
okay.
Throws for a little bit.
So my point was that we definitely saw a shift post-COVID of people less traveling, therefore potentially less impact of energy consumption from the transportation industry, and that shift to the data center, because more and more was done online, putting more and more pressures on data centers. But at the same time, you're seeing huge leadership positions coming from the transportation companies to drive change. So again, that's my point is the data center industry needs to do the same. We need to make bold moves and bold bets and take risks and try things. I agree with Chris on a couple of points. One, it's not going to happen overnight. There's no one right answer. We have to try many things to see what works. But I will also say, where I agree with Chris, that we do not want government regulating how this is done. We want to regulate it. What I will say is the one thing that is really causing people to make change is the potential carbon taxes that are coming, the ability to go after incentives. So right or wrong, that does incent people to drive change. And that's a good thing, but we have to get on the front end of it so we don't wind up in a situation where it's going in a direction that doesn't benefit the industry itself. We want to make sure that we're driving change in the right direction.
Just picking up on that, and Chris, I'll come to you in a second. Just picking up on that, and starting to pick up on our audience's questions as well. Because someone brought up to the chat that, for example, the European Commission is starting to look into waste heat recovery, not just within the data center industry, but beyond the data center halls, into other industries. But they also might impose some requirements on the data center sector. I mean, what's the panel's reaction to that? Because I guess that's where governments start getting a bit involved with these things. All right, we got a lot of people wanting to talk. Let me, Chris, because you were waiting to speak first. Do you want to say something?
I was just going to, on Wendy's point, by no means do I think corporations are benevolent. My point was we've got to loosen some of these regulations as it comes to utility grade infrastructure. So just to clarify.
Okay, thank you. So Mark Acton.
Yeah, I think, inevitably when governments get involved, all they're going to do is create a whole series of unintended consequences because they don't really understand what they're getting into. So I think the fear from my perspective is that they won't actually improve things. They'll potentially even make things worse. We talk about heat recovery. Well, that if you actually start giving heat away or selling your heat from a data center, you're potentially in the world of heat producers. And so you're going to get taxed as a heat producer. So that's not much incentive, and that's not necessarily true globally, but that's certainly something that is potentially a problem in Europe. So yeah, I mean, this isn't particularly joined up. So I think once the government get involved, you'll definitely see unintended consequences. So I think it's up to us to sort of demonstrate the fact that we've got a grip on this and we actually understand, and we have to educate as an industry as well. And it's not just government, it's the media, because we know government's responding to media. So I think there's a really important conversation with media that they get they get this right, because at the moment I don't think they are. I don't think they're really fully understanding the implications of what they're saying.
Okay, sure. I mean, it reminds me of that BBC kind of short documentary last year that we had about the dirty. What was it? They didn't call dirty data centers, but it was something around that.
Yeah, not dirty data, was it? It was. I forget what it was.
The data center's dirty little secret. It was about streaming.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
If you don't remember, I was in it. I'm really disappointed. Well, the point is that actually a really serious point. The EU and many other governments are talking about heat networks. Absolutely. Why? Because heat networks are a really positive way of getting your carbon footprint down. Because if you can reuse waste heat, you're taking out the carbon effect twice from whatever you're doing, or you're reusing it. And interestingly enough, there's a question been raised, I think, by my friend Henry Wong. I saw it. It's a really interesting question. To reuse the waste of heat of data centers, you'll be driven down the edge data center market, lots and lots and lots of very small data centers, which then you can reuse the waste heat locally in the building where you are. For example, if you put a 20 kilowatt data center in every single cheap hotel, your real estate costs nothing. It's 100 euros a night for the room. You throw away the bed, you plumb in the cabinet to the hot water system in the hotel. They use 20 kilowatts of hot water all day long, 24 hours a day, and instantly you're energy neutral in your data center. Now, whether or not you like that idea, it's one of those unintended consequences of what the government pushing us into reusing waste heat will lead to, because 100 or 200 or 300 megawatt data center inside the Arctic Circle cannot reuse its waste heat. There's nobody there to use it, and there's no one there that wants to use it because it's too frigging cold all the time, and that amount of heat won't actually make any difference. So you end up with this driving the model down to mini data centers, one rack, 20 kilowatts, 30 kilowatts, liquid cooled, and reuse the waste heat. And that is an unintended consequence. You might think it's good, you might think it's bad. I'm just saying that's why government shouldn't interfere in the natural process of business.
Interesting, especially as we are still a young industry, and the edge is still in its
1956 we started. We're not so young.
Oh well.
Please don't say that. That's
Mark, Seymour?
Yeah, so Ian's right. If we stick to air cooling, that we're basically driven down to the small data center. But obviously, if we're willing to go water cooled and get higher grade waste heat, then the whole ball game changes, because we can start turning that waste heat into power and distributing it, or using it more effectively. But you need to get that high grade heat out, which we don't get with air cooled systems. So it's one of the downsides of air cooled systems. But if you
I did say plumbed into the hotel.
Yeah, you did.
As in pipes, because you can't do it in water. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. So I think it's important that we are looking at all sorts of things, including changing technology, maybe not because people want liquid cooling, but because it makes sense from an environmental point of view. You can't really drive PUE down with liquid cooling very much, because PUE is pretty close to 1 already. People look at that and want to be able to justify it, but it doesn't make any sense because we're already nearly at 1. But if you start thinking about reusing the heat, then you're suddenly in a different ballgame, because now with liquid cooling, you've got much higher water temperatures, and you can make use of the energy. That's definitely a sustainable option for the data center industry moving forward.
Interesting. And Chris?
Yeah, I think there's a challenge. It's heavily geographic dependent. You know, Mark mentioned what government's been doing and pushing things. I mean, data sovereignty, for example, why does every country need its own data? Why do you want to see all these data centers developed, and then you've got the clash on them being developed within the country, right? So it's a constant. Mark's point on not having the government dictate a lot of those things. There's a lot of comments on distributed computing here. Well, we started with a mainframe, we went to distributed computing, and now we're back to mainframe with the cloud. And now we're talking about distributed computing again, right? In terms of what we're looking at. But to take distributed computing as an example and place small data centers, you're still going to go through a regulatory process. It might take you just as long as a big building, right? To get an approval and a permit and get things installed. And so I think people underestimate the amount of regulatory elements that hurt the industry in terms of ability to innovate on those fronts, not for malintent, but just for example, you may have a whole community that loves streaming, but they're going to have a NIMBY on not in my backyard of having a little data center within their environment. That's an eyesore. And we've got to, until we can educate some more folks around how these data centers actually work from a public service perspective, this will have help the environment, you want to commit to that, you're going to need these sorts of things. And until we can be honest about those things with the consumer is going to continue to be uneducated about it, and the government's going to continue to make policy that doesn't make any sense for the industry.
Okay, thank you. And Wendi.
So I agree with that. It's all about education, especially with the media, because they don't understand what it is the data centers are providing and doing and how we measure that success. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, it says my internet's slow. Okay, so a couple of points I wanted to make. The best way we can do that in that education is by having some analytics that are going to help us better manage the solutions and architectures that we're putting in play. So being able to, as I mentioned, control the energy usage, being able to then report out on where we are today and how we're getting better, and then be able to provide that in an auditable format is not even an option anymore. It's going to have to be mandatory of everyone. And that's a great way to show and educate others how we are making progress as an industry. I think we have to be able to implement those solutions. So part of it's around new architectures and new technology that's made more sustainable, the entire value chain of those products. But then the other part of it is the connection to the systems that are going to allow you to leverage some of these renewables and distributed energy resources more effectively, and then be able to report out on that and show the progress. So we have auditable data that says we are making an improvement as a data center industry, and that's what you feed the education to the media on and to the government bodies to say we are doing our part, and here's the proof of it.
That's a very good point. And Mark Acton.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You know, I think we talk about heat reuse, and we sort of navel gaze a little bit about the type of cooling that we're actually, trying to use for that. But the reality is that we can only reuse waste heat if we've got customers for the heat. And that's the real challenge. We've got loads of technology that we can use. And that, again, that really isn't the problem, whether it's direct liquid cooling or air, we can manage it. We don't have customers. Nobody wants it. And the one thing that governments can do in this, they can actually create communities of interest where we're sharing resources. So, there may be heavy energy users. Well, they may well therefore be creating heat. And I don't just mean data centers in that, I mean other industries too. And there are going to be people who want the heat. Breweries need heat to dry grain and create, beer. That's my personal favorite, but nobody seems to be interested. But so, we need to have that community of interest. And I think that's where government can help to actually allow us to export a resource to those who actually need it. At the moment, we just can't do that. Very, very few people have a need for that heat. That's the biggest challenge we face.
Okay. We are down to our last 5 minutes, so we can gather our final thoughts as well. But Chris, just carrying on this topic.
Yeah, to Dan's earlier point, I do think our must do is changing our base load to carbon free, and renewables are not the sole answer there. And I think as an industry, we should be pushing hard for nuclear as our base load across wherever markets that we're operating. I think that's an essential element. There is no other solution in the short term that looks forward. And for some reason, it's off the table in terms of the discussion, and I don't understand it.
Okay. Just as a closing question, I'm just going to pick up on a general question from the chat. So someone said, without wanting to sound like Greta, it's a climate emergency. Does the panel really think we have any choices? Who wants to say something along those lines? As we enter our 5 last minutes. Ian?
No.
Thank you. Mark Acton?
We've always got choices. It's a question of what we want to achieve. If we want to do away with data centers and digital services, we can all go back to the Middle Ages if we want, but I don't think anybody particularly wants that. So we're stuck with using them. Let's make them more efficient.
Definitely. Mark Seymour?
I think it's been said a lot of times that there are a lot of things we can do. So we have choices. What should we do? But we have to be doing something. So in that extent, no, we don't have a choice. We have to do something. And it must be to look at all elements of our systems, the way we use IT, the way the IT is designed, the way it's integrated with the facility, the way the facility is integrated into the network, power network. We've talked a lot about power, but there's still lots we can do within the data center and the data center facilities itself.
Okay, thank you. Dan?
I think one of the things that we can do as an industry is that, you know, the world is, we've got connection to every part of the world through the sector, right? You know, the internet gives us ultimate access to everyone on the planet. And I think that the industry can, not through this particular part in terms of the built environment, but through the operators, I think we can publicize the right steps to take and make more awareness around the criticality of this issue to all sectors and everyone, and pressure government to make the right decisions.
Okay. And Wendi?
So I feel similar comments to others. We need to work together. We need to test. It's on all of us, every single one of us, from the manufacturers to the builders to the consumers. Everybody needs to play a role here. We need to test new ideas, new architectures, new ways of doing this, ultimately so we can drive change together. But it's not going to happen alone. It's not going to happen without government. It's going to happen with. So everyone has to play their role, and we have to come together as an industry to drive to where we're ultimately trying to go, which is a carbon neutral world.
It's really getting to the stage where let's just roll up our sleeves and get the job done. Any other thoughts? If not, we can close here. And then if there's any other questions, our panelists will get back to you. Sorry, Ian?
Yeah, just one last thought. We had a coal crisis in 1875, and William Stanley Jevons described how to get out of it. And the only way to get out of it was to tax consumption. And I think that's where we're heading to. We've got to make sure that it's not cheap to go on the internet and use it. The users actually pay the consequences of the climate change that we're adding to. And at the moment we are adding to it, because the only way to avoid climate change is to decarbonize. And the way to decarbonize is to reduce consumption first.
Okay, that's a very interesting topic. And let's try to get some more views. Chris, very quickly.
And while I completely agree, that's the only way to get there, then we just make the divide between the rich and the poor even wider with the digital divide. So it's a terrible conundrum that we're in.
Yeah, because internet prices are quite high in some countries already. Dan?
I think I agree with Ian. I just think that there's going to be more of a question of allocating kind of carbon tax or carbon amounts that people are allowed to use. So everyone and every industry is aware of its carbon usage, and it's limited, or there's some form of measuring how that performs against other industries moving forward.
Okay. And Mark Acton, last one, 20 seconds, go.
Yeah, I just think, maybe taxation is the right direction, maybe consumption taxation. But again, we can't do that unless we truly understand the energy cost of digital services. And I don't think we're there yet. I think we've got a long way to go on that.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone so much. I thought it was a very insightful discussion. There's a lot of different aspects there that we can pick up to further discussion after the panel as well. For those watching, do stay tuned for more future panels on data center sustainability, a new Portman Partners and the Tech Capital panels on leadership, and a continuation of the Balancing the Boardroom series focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Soon you'll be able to watch or rewatch a recording of the panel on Portman's YouTube channel, as well as new updates on Portman's LinkedIn page. Thank you for joining us today. And from Portman Partners and the Tech Capital, see you next time.